Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 107, Jews and Judaism from Alexander the Great to Antiochus III. In our last episode, we discussed some of the literature of the Jews that was produced during the Hellenistic Age. Now that we have enough context to use them as sources of information, we can transition to looking at the history of the Jews at large, from the arrival of Alexander the Great to the earliest years of Seleucid rule. This will not only cover the dealings of Jerusalem, but also the consequences of the arrival of Hellenism, and how both Jewish life and Judaism as a whole responded to these developments. Before we continue, it is important to get a sense of geography, as recent political disputes regarding naming conventions require that it be addressed. The coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean has been a key area of focus as we have marched through to the 2nd century BC, but the regions we will be focusing on for the next several episodes are contained mostly within the modern states of Israel and Palestine, along with parts of Lebanon and Jordan. Both Israel and Palestine are designations that were used in antiquity, though some clarification is needed about their application. Israel, the name of the ancient kingdom of the early Iron Age from the time of Saul until the conquest of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 8th century, is not employed at all by the Greco-Roman authors. Most of the Jewish writers during the Greco-Roman period, like Josephus, considered it to be rather anachronistic, but applied it in an ideological sense rather than a strict geographic terminology. Writing in the 5th century, Herodotus describes the lands of Syria and the coastline as Palestine, a likely derivation from the name of the ancient Philistines who occupied the lands to the immediate west of Jerusalem. He seems to be encompassing not just key settlements like Gaza, but also the territory stretching from Egypt up to the borders of Phoenicia. This term carries forward to the time of Aristotle and later Hellenistic writers like Agatharchides of Cnidus. Scholars have debated about the true extent of the Greek conception of Palestine, mainly whether it included Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings, but it does not seem to have formed part of the Jewish point of view. This is complicated by the fact that during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the 130s AD, the destructive Bar Kokhba revolt saw him retaliate against the rebellious Jews by renaming Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina, part of the larger Roman province of Syria Palestina, and Palestine remained its common name thereafter. Throughout the Greek and Roman periods, Judea is the geographical term used specifically to describe the homeland of the Jews and the city of Jerusalem. This is based on the tribal name of Judah, sharing the same name as the historical kingdom of Judah, and in the Persian period the province was hailed in Aramaic as Yehud, which in turn was adopted by the Greeks as Judea and the Romans as Judea. Jewish authors like Josephus also found it to be acceptable, and it persists in much of our Greco-Roman writings as well, later becoming the name of the Roman province from the late Hellenistic period until the Bar Kokhba revolt. For the purposes of narrative convenience, I believe that Judea is the most accurate term to use when describing the area containing Jerusalem and its immediate surroundings during the Hellenistic period, but it is also worth pointing out that it is not inaccurate to use Palestine when talking about this region either. The extent of Judea's borders varies as we move forward into the Hasmonean and Herodian periods, but we can provide a reasonable sketch. Bordered by the Dead Sea and the Jordan River to the east, the city of Jerusalem would sit neatly in the center of Judea, among several hills as the most populated city in the area. To the immediate north was Samaria, confusingly the name both of a city and a geographical area, and though they were not considered to be Jewish, the Samaritan population nevertheless claimed to also worship the God of Israel. Galilee is even further beyond Samaria, a much more well-watered area that contains many hills and mountainous peaks, but also borders the valleys of Jezreel and Beth Shean, which enables the most productive agriculture of the region. To the south of Judea was Idumea, the land in the Bible known as Edom, and while for much of the Hellenistic period they were a separate nation and differed in religious customs, by the early 1st century BC they would be absorbed into the Hasmonean kingdom and had many converts to Judaism. King Herod the Great the infamous Jewish client king of the early Roman Empire, was himself of Idumean origins, much to the chagrin of the Judean elite. In the southeastern part of what is known today as the West Bank, the dry and desolate Judean desert runs alongside the coastline of the Dead Sea, just outside the limits of Old Jerusalem. It is an incredibly dry and craggy environment, perfect for any enclaves of persons looking to hide out. Famously, this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found near the ruins of the community of Qumran, and also where the rebels of the Jewish-Roman War and Bar Kokhba Revolt conducted their operations. On the opposite side, facing the Mediterranean, several port cities would dot the coast, running up into Phoenicia, bringing in trade from beyond the sea, and plenty of negative attention during the wars between the Hellenistic kingdoms. The history of the Jews, like many others living throughout the ancient Near East, extended back far earlier than before the arrival of the Greeks. While we may take the claim of Josephus that it stretched back nearly 5,000 years from his day with a pinch of salt, the extent to which we know their story by way of the Hebrew Bible is remarkable, though far too extensive to cover here. As archaic Greece started to hit its stride in the early to mid-6th century, Jerusalem was also just beginning to recover from calamity. The Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, had conquered the kingdom of Judah in 587 BC, destroying the first temple and ending Jewish independence for the next several centuries, forcibly carrying off much of the population back to his homeland. The Babylonian captivity, as it's called, lasted for nearly 50 years until the arrival of a new conqueror, Cyrus the Great of Persia, who defeated the last Babylonian king Nabonidus and brought Babylon into the fold of his fast-growing empire in 539. Cyrus was seen as a heroic figure by the Jews, as he issued a decree which allowed the exiles to return back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, thus bringing the captivity to an end. This event also marks a new epoch, the Second Temple period, a term used by scholars of Jewish history to mark the period from the end of the Babylonian captivity and rebuilding of the temple until its own destruction in 70 AD. One of the distinguishing features of the Second Temple period is that the Jews were under the rule of foreign kings and empires, and though Cyrus was considered a tolerant master, the new satrapy of Yehud would remain in control of the great kings of Persia for the next 200 years. This all changed in the 3rd century. In 334, Alexander the Great crossed into Asia to begin his conquest of the Persian Empire, thus dictating the course of the Near East for nearly a millennium. According to Josephus, during the siege of Tyre in 332, the Macedonian king issued a request to many of the neighboring cities to offer supplies. In Samaria, the governor Sanballat submitted to Alexander and offered troops to take part in the siege, and in return, the king promised to build a temple atop of Mount Gerizim. Jerusalem's high priest Judea declined the request on the grounds that he could not break his oath to Darius III while the great king was still alive. Following the conquest of Tyre and Gaza, the Macedonian ruler marched upon Jerusalem, but were intercepted by Judea and the Jerusalemite priesthood near Mount Scopus. To the surprise of all, Alexander fell upon his knees and bowed before the high priest, claiming that he had seen the same man in his dreams years earlier while in Macedonia, and now with his gaze upon him in person, bearing the name of God inscribed upon his headdress, he wished to pay homage to such a powerful being. The priest led the king to the temple, allowing him to sacrifice to the God of Israel, and in turn showed him the prophecies of Daniel, which predicted his future conquest of the Persian Empire. The authenticity of this story is suspect, for no other historian of Alexander reports this encounter besides Josephus himself. And despite his rosy description of early Judeo-Macedonian affairs, there is ample evidence that the invasion resulted in a good deal of violence for the region. Andromachus, the governor of Syria, was burned alive by the Samaritans. Alexander retaliated by destroying the city, and a new colony was eventually founded upon its ruins. Many Samaritans fled to the caves near Jericho with their families, but the recent discovery of their skeletons bunched together suggests they were killed by the Macedonians who lit fires near the entrance to asphyxiate them to death. In June of 323, Alexander the Great died in Babylon, inaugurating decades of civil war. For the first few years, Jerusalem seems to have avoided the chaos inflicted by the Diadochoi, but the aftermath of the Battle of Ipsus in 301 put an end to that. Though the victorious Seleucus I Nicator believed that the Levantine coast was rightfully part of his spoils from the battle, his former friend and ally, Ptolemy I Soter, took the opportunity to treacherously seize the lands of Coele-Syria in the meantime. Josephus reports that Ptolemy led an attack on Jerusalem using deceit, choosing to march upon the city on the Sabbath, a time when taking up arms by the Jews was largely prohibited, under the pretense that he was to make a sacrifice to the Jewish god, but then set his troops to seize the city for his own. Many Jews were taken captive, either as slaves to be sold on the markets by the soldiers, or forcibly resettled in Egypt to serve in the Ptolemaic armies themselves. For the next century, Judea would remain under the dominion of the Ptolemaic kingdom, integrated into the administrative and economic network that enabled the Ptolemies to become wealthy beyond measure. Like the rest of the Hellenistic Near East, the outskirts of Judea and Coele-Syria at large saw significant settlements of Macedonian colonists and fortresses, no doubt encouraged by the need for a militarized buffer zone between the two competitive empires. The largest of these was Ptolemais Akko, better known as Acre, a provincial capital that was founded upon an earlier settlement in 261, and became prominent enough to host a royal mint under both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Across the Jordan River was the city of Philadelphia, modern Amman in Jordan. To the north of that was Pella, Topket Fachel, and Jerash in the south. Little political activity during Ptolemaic rule is recorded, and like the rest of the kingdom's subjects, the Judeans were compelled to pay taxes to the Alexandrian government. However, one prominent family to emerge during the period were the Tobiads. According to Josephus, a greedy high priest named Onias II had failed in his task to collect the tribute demanded by Ptolemy III, who threatened to start selling off Judean land for his mercenaries as compensation. Joseph ben Tobiah, nephew of Onias and the son of an aristocrat who worked with the Ptolemaic government years earlier, leapt at the opportunity to solve the problem. With enough political support, he managed to overrule Onias's will and made the trip to Alexandria, where he outbid his competitors and gained the right to tax farm both Judea and Coele-Syria for Euergetes. Such was his role for the next 22 years, where he would use all manners of tactics to gather the money promised to the king, and enriching himself handsomely with whatever was left over. Located about 15 kilometers to the southwest of the modern city of Amman in Jordan, the town of Iraq al-Amir holds an archaeological site known locally as Qasr al-Abed. Translated as Castle of the Slave, this large stone building is a two-storied palace complex, constructed between 182 and 175 BC by Joseph's son, Hyrcanus, whose familial estates included the surrounding region. Scholars were able to match up with the palace's design to a description by Josephus, as the outer facades of the building were carved with images of lions that can still be seen today. It is, in fact, the only surviving palace from the Hellenistic period, and the episode transcript will attach photos of the site that I took during my visit to Jordan this past April. What we can learn from this story is the extent to which local strongmen within Jewish society could elevate their position and that of their families by working with the Hellenistic kings. Josephus claimed that Joseph's actions had helped enrich the region, but at the same time, he was ruthlessly exploiting his countrymen by using armies to put communities to the sword as an example to those who did not pay. The size of his palace and the extent of his estates also shows the influence of the landed Jewish nobility, which could and would help steer the direction of Judea. Unfortunately for the Jews, Judea and the rest of Coele-Syria became a sore spot for the neighboring Seleucid dynasty to the north, who never quite got over its theft by Ptolemy from their ancestor Seleucus I, and the city found itself embroiled in the chaos of being trapped between two competing empires. From 274 through 195, 5 Syrian wars raged up and down the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean, as both parties contested the other's supposed right to rule these lands. In the summer of 202, Antiochus III the Great launched his invasion of Coele-Syria, preying upon the weakness of the Ptolemaic state at his time, which was suffering from rebellion and had a child king upon the throne. Seeing the writing on the wall, High Priest Simon II and the elders of the city surrendered and allied themselves with Antiochus, providing the incoming king with supplies and troops. A Ptolemaic counterattack led by the Aetolian commander Scopas managed to recapture much of the lost territory in the winter of 202-201, including Jerusalem. But the Egyptian army was crushed shortly afterwards at the Battle of Panium in 200. Coeli Syria was ripped from the grasp of the Ptolemies for good, and so Judea fell into Antiochus's hands, never again to be under the control of Egypt. With Judea firmly under the control of the Seleucid Empire, let us turn to the organization and society of its inhabitants. As the largest city in the region not sponsored nor built by the Hellenistic kings, Jerusalem was the center of the Jewish world. From the Greek point of view, it was not recognized as a polis, which later became a point of contention during the reign of Antiochus IV. Instead, it can be classified as a temple state, more in line with the traditions of the ancient Near East, whereas the Greek city-state was structured around its citizen body. This is because the locus of Jewish political and religious life was the temple, or more accurately, the Second Temple, since in the second half of the 6th century BC, it replaced the one built by Solomon some 400 years earlier. Most descriptions of the Second Temple come from the time after King Herod, who oversaw extensive building programs and adornments that made it one of the most spectacular religious sites of the ancient world until its destruction in 70 AD. But during the early 2nd century BC, it was considerably smaller, and few of these original remains can be identified. It was situated within the Old City on an elevated plateau known as the Temple Mount, currently the site of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock. The layout consisted of an outer court and an inner court, the latter prohibited from Gentile visitors. Within the inner walls, there was the women's court, and after ascending the 15 steps, you reach the court of Israel. This is where most of the Jewish worshippers would have access to, divided by the sexes in their respective camps, but they would be able to observe the activities of the priests and make their own prayers. The center of most activity was in the court of priests, where the temple altar was located. Each and every day, the high priest was required to visit the altar to offer a sacrifice, known as the tamid, a perpetual offering, involving the slaughter of 2 lambs and burning their parts on the altar, along with incense, once in the morning and once in the evening. Ensuring the continuity of the daily sacrifice was considered of the utmost importance for the priests and the Jewish community as a whole. As far as we can tell, the only times that it was stopped was due to outside interference, namely the despoiling of the temple by Antiochus IV, and later its destruction by the future emperor Titus, both considered catastrophic events for the spiritual integrity of the Jewish nation. Along with the daily processions, there were 3 annual festivals where pilgrims from across the Mediterranean would flood into the city: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Josephus claimed that by his day, Jerusalem received millions of visitors for these festivals, and while we must imagine this took place on a much smaller scale during the Hellenistic period, many Jews indeed felt obligated to visit and take part in the celebrations. Beyond this main court was the most sacred part of the building, the Holy of Holies. Curtained off from the rest of the temple, this is where God was supposed to have first manifested, and unlike almost every other temple in antiquity, there was no cult statue, as Jewish law generally forbids graven images. Only the high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, even then limited to only a single day during the festival of Yom Kippur. It contained a few items: an empty elevated platform, representing the then missing Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, with 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and a large golden menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum symbolizing the tree of life and God's light. The temple menorah is different from the 8-branch personal menorahs used in Jewish households during Hanukkah, but the imagery of the temple menorah became synonymous with Jewish identity across the Greco-Roman world. Its earliest known representation was found on a coin of the last Hasmonean rulers dating to around 40 BC, but graffiti has been found on occasion in both Judea and other regions. One visiting the ruins of Ephesus in western Turkey may find it etched in the steps leading to the site's most famous monument, the Library of Celsus. However, the best known image of this menorah can be found on the Arch of Titus in Rome, showing Roman soldiers looting it from the temple following the end of the Jewish War. As the priest was the center of Jewish society, the leading political authority in Jerusalem was the high priest. Since the deposition of the last king, Zedekiah, by Nebuchadnezzar II, the monarchy had not been restored following the end of the Babylonian captivity. The high priests were always important figures due to their role as intercessor with the God of Israel, but they gradually assumed the sole responsibility as the head of state. It was they who would meet with the Gentile kings and their delegates when they came to Jerusalem, and were responsible for overseeing the collection of taxes. The high priests of the Second Temple period were almost entirely members of the Zadokite family until the Maccabean Revolt, but politicking between internal factions and outside intervention of the Hellenistic kingdoms could, and did, influence who was chosen for the position. Much like other religious figures, they were required to be free from pollution, meaning no contact with the dead, along with other stipulations such as being free of any disfigurements. Alongside the high priests was an institution known as the Sanhedrin, a group referred to in Greek sources as a boule or gerousia, which was functionally similar to those counterparts in a Greek polis, a council of Jerusalem's leading aristocracy who helped advise both legislative and judicial decisions. The most famous incident involving the Sanhedrin was the trial of Jesus mentioned in the Gospels, so it is clear that they held considerable sway with the affairs of the city. Economically speaking, Judea was not a terribly wealthy region, but we gain a fair degree of insight thanks to the documents of Zenon, an agent of Ptolemy II's financial minister Apollonius, as he spent the year 259-258 traveling throughout the land. It was supported primarily by agricultural products, the growing of grains like barley and wheat by local farming communities, and also through the herding of goats and sheep. Other Mediterranean staples like olive oil and wine were produced in abundance, some of which was exported to places like Egypt. Groves of palm trees bearing date fruits could be found near the oases, which continued to be an important part of the diet of those in the region today. A key trade good was the balsam tree, a plant valued for its extracts which could be used in perfumes and medicines. Judea was one of the few regions in the world that it was abundant, and the monopoly over it brought large amounts of income. Plantations of balsam were located near Jericho, and it became the center of a minor dispute when Mark Antony gifted these plantations to his lover, Cleopatra, much to the protestation of King Herod, as they were considered part of his royal revenues. Much of the driving factor of the economy itself was the activities of the temple, as goods and donatives would funnel into Jerusalem for the purpose of maintaining its daily operations. But while we will focus on the dealings of those living in Judea, the story of the Jews was not limited to the city and outskirts of Jerusalem. Diasporic communities could be found all over the Mediterranean and Near East, some established before and some established after the start of the Hellenistic period. Many lived in small pockets alongside their Gentile neighbors, especially within the largest cities where they were more likely to rub shoulders with a wide variety of backgrounds who were not Jewish. When there was a high enough concentration of Jews living in a region, they could organize themselves into a pseudo-colony, often, but not exclusively, known as the politeumata. Essentially, groups of foreigners who were able to acquire certain privileges from the monarchy that allowed them to live under their own ancestral laws, as long as they did not infringe upon those enforced by the crown. The most populous could be found in Egypt. By the 1st century BC, Alexandria contained perhaps the largest community of Jews outside of Jerusalem itself, dwelling mostly in the Delta quarter of the city, and a sizable population has been attested to living in the Elephantine and southernmost areas of the Nile. Upper Egypt was home to Aramaic-speaking families, descendants of those first settlers during the Persian period, whereas those of Lower Egypt in the Delta arrived later during the early Hellenistic age and spoke mainly Greek. Many of these newer families were brought by Ptolemy I in the late 4th century and incorporated into the Ptolemaic military, often given land to settle on and provide them with an income while they served in the army or navy. There is evidence that they could be quite organized. The Jews of Berenike and Cyrenaica were organized as a politeuma, and Strabo indicates that the politeuma of Alexandria was governed by an ethnarch. Given the proximity to Judea, there were also plenty of Jews within the borders of the Seleucid Empire. According to Josephus, Seleucus I granted the Jews living in Antioch the right of citizenship and self-governance, where they gathered in abundance, especially in the neighborhood of Daphne, and Syria would become a major nexus of Jewish life following the annexation of Jerusalem. In Asia Minor, we find several cities that bear evidence of a Jewish population. Josephus claims that Antiochus III settled about 2,000 Jewish families in the area of Lydia and Phrygia around 205 BC as part of an ongoing effort to stabilize the region. His reconquest of this area, especially his capture of Sardis from his rebellious governor in 216, must have caused serious damage. In fact, one of the major surviving structures of the archaeological site of Sardis is its synagogue, the foundations of which date to the 1st century BC, and it is the largest surviving building on the site that can be visited today. Jewish communities could also be found as far east as Mesopotamia, descendants of those taken into the Babylonian captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, who refrained from returning to Judea and continued to live in Babylonia under Persian and later Seleucid rule. We find evidence of them both within Babylon and the newly established capital of Seleucia on the Tigris, in addition to the many villages of the countryside. It is not until the Hellenistic period that the first influx of Jewish settlers in Europe occurred. The earliest known reference to a European Jew is a stele found in the temple of Amphiaraus in the Greek city of Oropos in Attica. Dating somewhere between the 3rd and 2nd century BC, it records the manumission of a slave named Moschos, son of Moskion, and a self-proclaimed Judaios. However, we find out that Moschus set up the inscription because he was visited by the hero god Amphiaraus in his dream and ordered him to do so. This has struck many scholars as rather bizarre, since despite his insistence that he was indeed Jewish, he nevertheless was recognizing and following the instructions of Greek deities. It also challenges the presumption that being Jewish and solely worshipping God are nigh inseparable. But here we have someone acknowledging the existence of an alien god in a positive capacity while still identifying as a Judaios. Other cities in Greece would see the arrival of Jewish immigrants, as would Roman Italy, particularly after the conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BC, where they would settle in cities like Rome and Ostia. Though often far removed from their ancestral homeland, these diasporic Jews nevertheless remained closely linked to Jerusalem and deeply invested in its affairs. Traditionally, each adult male living abroad would need to contribute a half shekel for the maintenance of the temple. The Roman orator Cicero observed, rather cynically, how diasporic Jews would send great amounts of money back to Jerusalem each year, while Alexandrian synagogues would portion off funds from market sales for the same purpose. The letters attached to the beginning of 2nd Maccabees were addressed to these Egyptian Jewish communities, urging them to celebrate the Hasmonean-sponsored festival of Hanukkah. The fact that they were recorded at all would at least imply a close connectivity between the two, and the Hasmoneans considered them important enough to reach out for legitimacy. The bond between the temple and the diasporic communities remained strong. But one notable trend in the development of Jewish society was the increased importance of the synagogue. The Greek word synagoge, meaning assembly, is a translation of the Hebrew bet knesset, house of assembly, and evidence of its use is found as early as the 1st century BC through a priestly inscription from Jerusalem. These individual centers of faith allowed the Jews who were unable to make the pilgrimage to meet their spiritual needs and education. Evidence for their interaction with the Hellenistic monarchies may be found in numerous dedications on behalf of the Ptolemaic rulers when they built their synagogues, presumably after receiving approval for them to do so. This decentralization of religious authority away from the high priests was a slight one, but would accelerate dramatically as a consequence of the temple's destruction in 70 AD. the Greeks think of the Jews? Despite the abundance of information that we have and their prominence from the perspective of biblical history, Jerusalem and its citizens were considered a minor faction at best for much of classical antiquity. Herodotus does not seem to have been aware of them, or at least consider them so unimportant as to pass over them when writing his histories, and we find no Greek account describing them until over a decade after the Macedonian conquests. Our earliest sources come from the likes of Theophrastus, the famous botanist and peripatetic philosopher who made a comment about the sacrificial practices of the Jews in roughly 315. In his account of Mauryan India about 10 years later, the Seleucid diplomat Megasthenes made a brief comparison of the Brahmin philosophers to the high priests of Jerusalem, though does not elaborate much more than that. It is not until Hecataeus of Abdera, a Greek historian of the late 4th century, who composed a history of Egypt, possibly on the orders of Ptolemy I, to be the first to extensively write about the Jews. His otherwise lost work is preserved mainly by Diodorus of Sicily. According to him, he believed that the Jews' origins lay in Egypt, but he gives a reasonably accurate, if slightly misunderstood, account of contemporary Jewish society, possibly based on interviews with the communities living in Egypt. Complicating matters are a number of passages cited by Josephus and Philo that are attributed to Hecataeus, which are so explicitly pro-Jewish that many scholars have doubted the authorship entirely. But within the context of Diodorus's more authentic account, Hecataeus is consistently ambivalent. Interestingly, he and other Greek authors appear to be quite aware of Moses, who was reinterpreted in the heroic Greek archetype as a city founder, lawgiver, and philosopher. Though there were some things to be admired, the Jewish religion and their customs aroused curiosity, mockery, or even outright hostility. In a world where polytheism was the norm, Greeks and Romans found the dedication of the Jews to their one god to be extremely unusual. The observance of the Sabbath was another, and was ruthlessly exploited by commanders during their attacks against Jerusalem. Male circumcision was considered especially striking, but not entirely unfamiliar, as Egyptians apparently followed this practice as well. As time passes, later authors became far more venomous in their mocking attacks against the Jews. Satirists like Juvenal and Petronius mocked their dietary restrictions and supposed greediness. An even worse picture is painted by the likes of Diodorus and Tacitus, who accused the Jewish people of being misanthropic and xenophobic against all outsiders. Some scholars believe that a gradual shift within the Greek sources can be detected as a consequence of the Maccabean Revolt and the aggressive expansion of the Hasmonean kingdom. With the accounts or texts that mention the Jews after 164, there was an increasingly negative attitude in the stories of Greek authors, possibly circulated early by Seleucid historians looking to discredit the Hasmonean movement. One of the key moments in the history of the Second Temple period was the Maccabean Revolt, supposedly a conservative reaction to an increasingly prevalent Hellenistic influence. This is a topic that we will delve further into the next episode, but we must ask the question, how did those within Jewish society respond to the arrival and dominance of Greek culture? By way of Persian rule, Aramaic became a lingua franca throughout Judea and much of the Near East, including in written forms. This does not mean that Hebrew disappeared, and in fact we see a bit of resurgence of it in the Hellenistic period. The later editions of the Book of Daniel was written in Hebrew, as was 1st Maccabees. But it is believed that Aramaic was the dominant tongue of the average citizen in Judea. A notable change, though, was the introduction of Greek, as both an administrative and literary language. Within Judea, its impact among the local population was largely limited to members of the elite, who were engaged with the administration of the Macedonian rulers or were keen to partake in Hellenistic literary culture, but those living in the diaspora adopted it wholesale. Like in Egypt and Mesopotamia, many Jews made use of double names. Some were renditions of Hebrew. For instance, Yeshua was turned into Jason, but we also find stereotypically Greek ones as well, with Hasmonean kings taking the names of Alexander, Aristobulus, and Antigonus. This also applies to their allusion to the Jewish god, as inscriptions believed to be tied to Alexandrian synagogues list the titles Theos Megalos, the greatest god, and Theos Hypsistos, the highest God, instead of the traditional Yahweh. Going alongside the increased use of Greek as a spoken and written language, the sheer amount of literature produced by the Greek-speaking Jewish communities is quite substantial. We spoke of the works of Josephus in the books of the Maccabees, which survived for us intact, but there are others that we are given hints about. One of the most interesting was by Ezekiel the Tragedian, an Alexandrian poet living during the 2nd century BC, who composed the Exagoge, a 5-act adaptation of the Exodus story, and the earliest known Jewish play. A few passages do survive, revealing some curious details about its production, such as an allusion with Moses' staff turning into a snake and back, and the voiced appearance of God as a key character in the form of the burning bush, thus avoiding any potential sacrilegious depictions of graven images. A similar exercise was done by a Jew named Sosides, dubbed the Jewish Homer, who composed an epic in similar hexameter structure that worked the Hebrew Bible into something akin to the Iliad or Odyssey. The Jewish historian Eupolemus, working just after the Maccabean Revolt, composed On the Kings of Judea, a history of David and Solomon that served as the earliest account of a Jewish history written for a Greek audience. Outside of Josephus himself, the most prolific Jewish author and the culmination of the Alexandrian diaspora was Philo. Writing during the time of the Julio-Claudian emperors, Philo contextualized the teachings of the Torah through the language of Greek philosophy. He acknowledges the apparent inconsistencies within the texts of the Bible when subjected to rational explanation, but defended its legitimacy as a source of wisdom and through the author's application of divinely inspired allegory. But perhaps the most influential literary contribution was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. A document known as the Letter of Aristeas is purportedly a conversation addressed between an Alexandrian Greek named Aristeas and his brother Philocrates, dating sometime to the late 3rd to early 2nd century BC. According to the letter, Ptolemy II Philadelphus ordered that his newly developed library in Alexandria be supplied with the world's greatest sources of learning. His chief librarian Demetrius of Phalerum reported to the king that the Jews possessed many books of wisdom, but because they did not speak Hebrew, they were unable to translate the texts, even if they managed to acquire them. Aristeas was a friend of the king and advised that he would be able to gain the trust of the elders of Jerusalem if he was to free all enslaved Jews within his kingdom's borders. Ptolemy thus followed suit and sent an embassy to the high priest Eleazar, accompanied by gifts of gold and silver for the temple, requesting that they provide a copy and translation of the Hebrew Bible. 72 scholars traveled to Alexandria, 6 drawn from each of the 12 tribes, and were welcomed by the Ptolemaic staff, who escorted the elders to the island of Pharos, where they worked tirelessly for 72 days and nights. Upon its completion, they read it aloud for King Ptolemy, who celebrated its achievement and vowed to protect it as a treasure within his library. The edition that was created was known as Septuagint, which technically means of the 70, a corruption from the story's 72 translators. This elaborate story, and perhaps Aristeas himself, is believed to be largely fictitious, but the exercise itself serves multiple purposes. It is instead a foundational myth of sorts, created by the Egyptian Jews to legitimize their translation as being on par with that of the original Hebrew. Its creation being the collective responsibility of all 12 tribes of Israel earns it a divinely inspired origin akin to that of the Torah. For those Jews whom Greek was the first, and perhaps only language, this allowed them to engage in the same authentic worship as their counterparts in Jerusalem, and thereby strengthen their connection to their faith. It is also worth pointing out that by associating its creation with Ptolemy II, famed for his devotion to the building of the Library of Alexandria, the translation should thus be accorded a similar level of literary prestige and legitimacy as Greek authors like Homer or Euripides. However, the historical impact of the Septuagint cannot be understated, and perhaps it is one of the most influential events of the whole Hellenistic period. By translating it into Koine Greek, the wisdom of the Hebrew Bible was made available to non-Hebrew speakers, thus opening up the potential for those outside the faith to study and learn from it. The Jews themselves did not directly gain a mass influx of converts, but this would form the basis of the earliest doctrines of Christianity, which was able to attract followers from many parts of the Hellenistic, then Roman, world. It is no surprise then that the New Testament was written entirely in Greek by the followers of Jesus, and by extension were able to spread their teachings in a much more accessible manner to the wider population. An interesting tradition suggests a connection between Jerusalem and Sparta. According to Josephus and 1 Maccabees, a letter was written by King Arius I of Sparta to the high priest Onias I in the early 3rd century, initiating diplomatic contact, claiming that the Spartans were also descendants of Abraham and thus share a kinship with the Jews. Scholars are doubtful about the letter's authenticity, as it would make little sense as to why the Spartans would have bothered to engage with a small actor within the Ptolemaic realm. However, the Hasmoneans who champion the legitimacy of this letter then reveal a desire to be perceived as sharing a common bond with one of the most celebrated Greek city-states to exist, thereby enhancing their standing with the wider community. As we saw with Joseph ben Tobiah, members of the Jewish nobility could jockey for better positions under the political authority of the Hellenistic kingdoms. This is not surprising nor exclusive to the Jews, and we can find parallels within the Egyptian and Babylonian communities who negotiated to maintain their privileged status. Beyond the adoption of Greek names or enrolling them in a classical education, some noble Jewish families went so far as to not have their sons circumcised to better fit in with the strongly Greek customs of the gymnasium, renouncing what was a clear indicator of their Jewish identity. We might be slightly misled by the interpretations of the books of Maccabees, which imply that one of the root causes of the revolt itself was a conservative anti-Hellenic faction who championed against a sinful lifestyle, particularly among the aristocratic families of the countryside. Yet those same champions, the Hasmoneans, quickly adopted the same language and trappings of power as per the role of a Hellenistic monarchy. Even the texts of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are written in exceptional Greek, whose authors were clearly educated in Greek literature, despite stressing the alleged incompatibility of Hellenismos with Judaismos. But there is a legitimacy in the frustrations expressed by the Jews living under Greek rule. In chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, the pseudo-prophetic visions of the eponymous protagonist describe the martial context between the king of the north, the Seleucids, and the king of the south, the Ptolemies. The author uses imagery equating these rulers to natural disasters, and the destruction inflicted upon Jerusalem during the 5th Syrian War was particularly bad. A consequence of living in the highly contested buffer zone between two empires meant that the risk of enslavement of those living in the countryside was always quite high. As I mentioned earlier, Ptolemy I enslaved and forcibly resettled thousands of Jews after his capture of Jerusalem, and a decree made by Ptolemy II regarding the treatment of captive persons from Coeli Syria indicates that this was a common occurrence. There were also misunderstandings or conflicts between Jews and non-Jews regarding the former's unique religious practices. As I relayed earlier, Gentiles were given limited access to the temple on the grounds of religious doctrine, but fear of sacrilege did not dissuade visitors though, who on occasion would take liberties, such as Pompey the Great, who entered the Holy of Holies in 63 BC following his capture of the city. Maintaining its sanctity from foreign intrusion was such a concern that a Greek inscription was set up in the 1st century in the court of Gentiles, warning those who dare pass beyond would risk death if they did so. Being without independence for centuries, the feeling of resentment against the dominance of Greek culture may have been a real thing. Josephus offers a critical view of some aspects of the influence of the Greeks and the Hellenistic kings, who put a stamp on the landscape which may have rubbed many the wrong way. Quote, "And some of those nations do still retain the denominations which were given by their first founders, but some have lost them also, and some have only admitted certain changes in them, that they might be the more intelligible to the inhabitants, and they were the Greeks who became the authors of such mutations. For when, in after ages, they grew potent, they claimed to themselves the glory of antiquity, giving names to the nations that sounded well in Greek, that they might be better understood among themselves, and setting agreeable forms of government over them, as if they were a people derived from themselves." End quote. By the time of Antiochus IV, the tension between some members of the Judean elite and the Seleucid monarchy would reach a breaking point. On the next occasion we meet, we will return to the narrative following the Sixth Syrian War and look to the outbreak of the Maccabean Revolt.